first of all, Professor Felipe, warmest greetings in the frameworks of the project City as a Classroom.
It's very kind of you to have me. Thank you.
It is very exciting you to have in our program, since you are one of those individuals that contributed a lot to the understanding of the history of this planet via many different works that are not only about history, but they are interdisciplinary works.
Well, it's very kind of you to say so. I'm glad somebody thinks so.
And my first question would be, before getting to cities, could you please tell what makes you keep on doing this activity, keep researching history and being so true to this research? Because one of your first books about Spanish civilizations came out in 1975, I think. So it's been a long time.
Yes, well, I am very old. And I suppose what keeps me at work is simply the fact that I'm not yet dead. I can't think of any other vocation that I can do. It's the one talent which is death to hide. And historical problems are fathomless. The beauty of history as an intellectual discipline is that its problems can never be resolved because the evidence isn't present to our senses. So every inquiry is open-ended, every inquiry is limitless, and you never get to the end of the questions. In fact, you never get to the solution of any single question. And so it's a process. I mean, studying history is an infinitely extensible process, and if you're really committed to it, nothing will stop you short of death.
I got it. So, Professor, when we speak about world history, could you please share your viewpoint on, I mean, your attitude, let's say, towards mainstream official history, which is presented in the textbooks in educational system? How do you think, how accurately or how not accurately, I mean, mainstream history is, I mean, presented to people in general?
Well, I don't know whether it's possible to generalize to that extent. Another of the charming things about history, as well as its infinite extensibility, is its infinite variety. And every time you adopt a particular point of view, you see things differently, because the way you see things is not a function of how they really are. It's a function of how you look at them. And therefore, every historian or everybody who's a historical writer or a teacher in a school will have a different take on what they see when they look at the past. And if, like me, you know, you're a professional historian, you're paid to do it, you can study the sources directly, and that gives you a sense of being closer to the real events, or at least to the minds that witnessed and recorded those events than you otherwise would be. Of course, most history, I mean, you know, if I accept your invitation and if I'm tempted to comment at the level of generalization that you seek, I'd say that most historical work isn't like that. It's not written with reference to the sources. It's written with reference to other secondary works. And of course, most people only learn about history through school or through reading popular divulgation, popular writings which are not focused on the sources. And I don't want to complain about that. I mean, I think everybody's perfectly, if people are happy studying that way, then let them do so. But obviously that's not the way that I like to approach it. I like to try and get as close as I can to the testimony of the people who really took part, because I suppose what interests me, and maybe again, this isn't something that you get from most historical work, what really interests me is you know, just trying to have a sense of what it felt like to be in the past, and sympathizing with people in the past, even people who seem horrible, evil, wicked dictators and imperialism, as well as their victims. So one really wants to try and sympathize with everybody and share their point of view. And I suppose most people who study history are not particularly interested in that. Most people who study history want to know what really happened rather than how people felt about it at the time. It's those penetrating those feelings that's my objective. But when I say that, I do want to stress that I'm not trying to say that everybody ought to do history the way I like to do it. I'm just trying to say that's the way I like to do it. And maybe that's the difference with that very general kind of historical writing that you mentioned in your question.
Professor, back in the 90s, you have been researching Canary Islands, which is a unique place, and it's also one of the research interests of the Expeditionary Corps, which conducted field research there. So can we speak a little bit about Guanches? According to the legends, they were extremely powerful people that were able to knock off the horse with one hand, as legends say. So could we please take a look at them from the viewpoint of cities? I mean, what did it take? I mean, why Guanches were shaped the way they were? I mean, is it because of the setting, environment, history? What is it?
Well, I think you've asked a very difficult question because, of course, we've got very little in the way of source material to take us into the minds of Aboriginal or native Canary Islanders. I like to use the word Guanche only to mean the inhabitants of Tenerife, whereas, of course, as you know, there are lots of Canary Islands, and I think even within one island, you can see that there are cultural differences between different peoples who inhabited them before the Spaniards arrived. But we don't have very much in the way of evidence for how they thought or felt, or even how they behaved. The evidence is really largely archaeological, or consists of descriptions by European visitors or Europeans to whom visitors reported. One of the very earliest texts about the native Canary Islanders that we have was actually written by Boccaccio on the basis of reports that were brought back to him by navigators who had visited the island in the early 14th century. So it's very, I think one's got to preface everything one says by saying your question's very hard to answer. And the honest answer is we don't really know. But I mean, I think that the overwhelming evidence suggests that these were the descendants of pre-Berber inhabitants of North Africa. I think their culture was very similar to the Snaga and the Imragan of the Saharan seaboard. And so if we want to know what they were like, we really need to look at those people. And clearly there are cultural differences because those people or their descendants, living descendants, such few as survive today, are fishers. They're fisher folk. Whereas most of the Canary Islanders at the time of the Spanish conquest seem to have been pastoralists. They had sheep, they looked after sheep, they grew, they were also, in a small way, agriculturists, they grew wheat. And their diet was a mixture of grains and sheep's milk. In a curious way, the people of the Canary Islands today, all of whom, of course, are descended from colonists from Europe, still have something of the same culture because their main food is a similar kind of thing. As of course the great Canary dish is called gostion, which is really a mixture of grain with water or milk. So that was really the basis of their culture. But you're right that they were very strong in the sense that they were able to resist European would-be conquerors for generations. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, to think the first permanent European settlers of the Canary Islands arrived in 1402, and it wasn't until 1496, after Columbus had been to America, that they finally subdued the last indigenous resistance. If you look at that record, it's a generation after generation of sustained resistance, at least in some of the islands or some corners of some of the islands. It's a big contrast with most of the other subsequent areas of European overseas expansion, where on the whole, indigenous peoples submitted, capitulated, made agreements with the invaders very much faster than that. So I guess you're right, they were extraordinarily strong in the sense of being able to resist European invasion for a very long time. What enabled them to do that? Well, I think you're right when you mention the environment. The Canary Islands are very diverse environmentally, very difficult for invaders to accommodate all those different environments. Each of the indigenous peoples occupied a particular biome within these very diverse islands, and they knew what they were doing in their own environment, so they were able to exploit the advantages of the terrain to defend themselves. And there are lots of descriptions of battles in which they rained rocks down on the heads of the Spaniards with sometimes with tremendous success. And as usual, the Spaniards defeated them really by employing other islanders, as they were all divided amongst themselves and fought each other. And the Spaniards were able to exploit those divisions, as they were subsequently in some of the other terrains that they expanded into, especially in the New World. So I think the implication of your question is right. The environment is the key to the defensibility of any terrain.
And have you ever looked into the architecture of different civilizations, to architects? I mean, what is different between today's architecture that surrounds us and the one that existed, let's say, 2 centuries ago?
Well, I suppose it depends what you're talking about. Again, the world's a big place, and there's a lot of different architectures always going on. But I suppose the history of architecture can really be written in terms of an alternation of innovation and tradition. So broadly speaking, what tends to happen in the history of architecture is that
may I comment in here, just to clarify my question? I'm sorry, when we look at this, could we look at the architecture from the perspective of symbolism? Because it's believed that symbols do influence people unconsciously very, very powerfully. So modern architecture, certainly it influences people, but in different ways. It makes them feel maybe bad because the building is not comfortable or something else. But we know that the architecture of the past, especially if we speak about Spanish civilizations, they were magnificent architects that would create just masterpieces that cannot be repeated even today.
Yes, but of course, architecture is not only an elite art. I mean, one of the reasons why you're right to draw attention to its social influence is that it's something which everybody sees inescapably. You know, if you're right, and we're very urban, everybody lives in a building, and everybody passes monumental buildings, ostentatious buildings which evince those social and cultural symbols that you alluded to. They pass them every day, you know, on their way to work. And but someone who never goes to an art gallery can't escape art because they see it in the buildings that they pass when they're walking around. Every sort of architectural setting, you're going to get some people who feel very comfortable and others who don't. But I think in a curious way, although we live in a very democratic age, we also live in an age where architecture has been very highly professionalized. And one of the things that always happens when you empower a professional elite, those guys, they boss you around. You know, they tell you what you should think, they tell you where you should live, what sort of space you should be living in, what your environment should look like. And architects, you know, they're a bit like doctors. They're very bossy. They think they know. They think they know best. Whereas in the past, of course, you know, architecture was somewhat less professionalized than it has recently become. You know, architects were formed with a very broad, typically very broad humanistic education. They studied a lot of different subjects. They didn't spend so long focused entirely on their own professional curricula. So if the implication of your question is right and people feel less comfortable with buildings of the recent past than they do with more traditional ones, that's probably why. On the other hand, one of the changes that has happened in my adulthood is the rise of what is sometimes rather sneeringly called post-modern architecture, but which to some extent represents an attempt to break with this elitist ethos and to try and create you know, works that are more modest in scale, more decorative, more fun to see and to live in. And although you know, I don't like works of postmodern architecture, one does see there's a big revulsion from, you know, the notions or Le Corbusier type notion of the building as a machine, and we are seeing a revulsion from brutalist and rationalist architecture in favour of much more modest buildings, which I think on the whole are more sympathetic places for people to live in and work in. And we've also seen a new rise of classicism in architecture. My own university, University of Notre Dame, has been, you know, in the United States, a place with our own architectural school has been in the forefront of promoting the return of classicism, and that also, you know, means building stuff which is more attuned to the traditional aesthetics of the customer and less to the theoretical notions of the omniscient professional. So you know, I think we're in a transitional phase, and we seem to be moving away from uncongenial to deliberately uncongenial architecture, which tells you you've got to live in this because we know it's better for you, to a more humane kind of way of designing places for people to live.
Okay, and my last question would be about primary sources that are used in the research. So the question is, how far can we go back into the history when we are capable of proving our statements and facts with primary sources like the old treatises, old manuscripts?
Well, I don't think we're capable of proving anything because the sources only tell you what people want you to know. So, you know, so source, famous historian who was also a professor of philosophy at Oxford, R.G. Collingwood, said all history is intellectual history, by which he meant that the sources only tell you, you know, what's going on in people's heads when they write them down. On the other hand, it is possible to practice, you know, what I think some specialists call cognitive archaeology, to look at the material objects of the past and make certain inferences about the way people lived, unquestionably, and maybe also about the way they thought. I mean, I always draw my own students' attention to those. Well, you know, in Ukraine, you're not far from the Russian steppes, and you know about, you know, those mammoth dwellings that were built 20,000 plus years ago out of mammoth ivory. And when you look at a building like that, although you can't say definitively or prove, you know, your suspicions about what they thought they were doing, you can see something which is definitely evidence of a soaring imagination, an imagination which sees a mammoth stone and turns it into a dwelling, and also a dwelling which is used for more than just living in. It's also used for worship, as well as for all the routines of daily life. So just in that sort of way, you can use cognitive archaeology to take you back into the past. Like, you know, I mean, I'm not a specialist in it, but I'm very interested, and I've written a lot about it, especially in the Oxford Illustrated History of the World, which I edited recently, in which I read a chapter about this, and in the Cambridge History of the World, I wrote a chapter on the Paleolithic period, in which I tried to do this, to use material objects to conjure up what it must have felt like to be there, and to try and, you know, kind of reconstruct people's thoughts. And then I suppose the final resource that one has, spoken about documents, we've spoken about objects of material culture. The final resource one has is analogy. For example, a moment ago when we were talking about the Canary Islands, I said that I thought you could make some inferences about the way of life of the pre-colonial population by looking at analogies illuminated by anthropological research amongst similar peoples today. And so you can say something about the ancient Canary Islands, I think, by inference from the Imragan and the Znaga. And similarly, I think, you know, you can make some inferences about pre-literate societies generally from studying such pre-literate societies as survive today, about foraging societies generally, about such foraging societies as survive today. And as long as you don't make the mistake of thinking that you can prove anything, and you know, you have the modesty to acknowledge that all of these techniques, written sources which only take you into people's minds, the material objects about which you have to make inferences of your own, the analogies about which you may be completely wrong. Nonetheless, provided you're modest about it, you can use this combination of techniques to take you right back into the past. And as you may know, since you're kind enough to be a reader of my work, I mean, I've tried to take this, you know, back into the hominid past, going back before Homo sapiens, and using analogies with other non-human primates to try and understand what drove, what made those people tick. More than 200,000 years ago, before Homo sapiens emerged in the fossil record. And I'm very modest about this. I may have got the whole thing completely wrong, but I think it's worth trying to do it because it makes a kind of science of the effort to sympathize with people who are very different from you. I mean, I think if there's anything to be gained from history, it's that sympathy, the ability, if you can sympathize with people in cultures different from your own, then you can begin to sympathize with your own contemporaries a little better. And if you can actually do what I've been trying to do and apply the same techniques to other species, I mean, you know, what a mind-broadening exercise that is, and how it opens up possibilities of understanding people with whom you may disagree in your own world.
Thank you, Professor Felipe. It was an exciting talk. Thank you for your time, and I'll keep you updated.
It's very kind of you to taken interest. I hope some of that is of some use. It's been a great pleasure meeting you and talking to you.